أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. أما بعد, we'll continue with al-Muqadimat lesson, and we'll continue from where we left off last time, basically from Aqsam al-Hukm al-Aqli, the types of rational judgment or logical judgment. The Sheikh is saying, وأقسامه ثلاثة الوجوب والاستحالة والجواز. There are three types. الوجوب, wajib, it means mandatory or necessary. Istihala means impossible. والجواز is possible. These are the three types of rational judgment. And then the Sheikh is explaining this part of the متن, the text. لابد من حذف مضاف في هذا الكلام تقديره إثبات. So basically he's just saying, like, from a linguistic point of view, it's just one of the Arabic language characteristics. When you talk, you don't have to spell out or to say every single word. Some words are omitted and understood by the context. So you're just saying you have to say here, in order to understand it like fully, there is an omitted verb here. It says إثبات, affirming what is necessary, affirming استحالة, or establishing or affirming the استحالة, affirming or establishing al-jawaz, and so on. So this is basically just a part of like linguistics, so we don't need to go through it. ووجه انحصار الحكم العقلي في هذه الثلاثة أن كل ما يحكم به العقل إما أن. So basically this part here, Sheikh is saying, so why are there only three parts or three types of al-hukm al-aqli? Why there are only three? So he's explaining that this division is rational division. And that is because anything your mind or your rationale make a judgment about is either susceptible to affirmation or non-existence or negating. So both of them. It's basically affirming those, like accepting those, or accepting, affirming only, or accepting, negating only. So the first one, which he basically accepts, it could either be this or that. It could either like accept being affirmed or accept being denied or negated. This is basically possible because it is possible to be either this or that. The second category or the second type here is something that only accepts being affirmed. And if it only accepts being affirmed, then it's a necessary. Right? It cannot be negated. And the third is basically the opposite. It accepts only being negated, cannot be affirmed as a happening or occurring. And that is basically the impossible, al-mustahil. So this is basically like a quick introduction from the Sheikh on the three types. And then he goes on to address and talk about every type of those three types, starting with the necessary, حد الواجب. What is al-wajib? So he's saying, فالواجب ما لا يتصور في العقل عدمه. Your rationale, your mind cannot imagine it's negating. إما ضرورة, either by necessity, for example, like تحيز للجرم, like particle or a mass, it has to fill a space. If you imagine a mass or a particle or a body, you have to affirm to that body a space that body fills from the space. Otherwise, it is not there. So by affirming a germ or a particle or a body or something like that, basically you are also necessarily affirming التحيز, a characteristic of تحيز, filling part of the space or filling certain volume or part of this of that space that basically allow that particle to stand on its own. وإما نظرا, or through addressing or through looking or studying that matter in detail in order to reach that conclusion. نظرا, with basically applying applying rationale and applying thinking process. Consideration, right? كوجوب القدم لمولانا جل وعز. Basically, like for example, affirming and establishing the beginningless of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is a necessary, it is a wajib, حكم, necessary judgment, rational judgment, but it is not apparent right away. You have to consider and think about it, and basically through your thinking and consideration you reach that conclusion. So you reach a conclusion which is necessary, but it takes thinking process. Whereas the first type, which is necessary by like right away, it's something that is clear to your mind, close or near to your mind. You have thought about it before, or it's basically easier for your mind to establish right away. And basically that's what the Sheikh is saying here. يعني أن حقيقة الواجب العقلي هو ما لا يتصور في العقل عدمه، أي لا يدرك في العقل عدمه. You cannot realize that it does not exist, right? That realization of its non-existence is basically impossible. That's why it's necessary. It's necessary to exist in your mind. إما ضرورة, أي ابتداء بلا تأمل, without consideration, ابتداء right away, كالتحيز للجرم, as we said, like massing, filling part of space. وهو أخذه قدر ذاته من الفراغ, which is basically taking that part we talked about. فإن ثبوت هذا المعنى له لا يتصور في العقل ضرورة نفيه. So basically you cannot imagine negating that meaning and that characteristic of this particle once you imagine it. And also another example of that is basically كون الاثنين أكثر من الواحد. Two is more than one. You can basically right away establish that your mind, it's a necessary judgment. You cannot say no. Two may not be more than one. That's basically nonsense. Okay? And again, that's necessary, that's daruri, that's right away you can make that judgment. وإما نظرا, أي بعد التأمل, after consideration, كثبوت القدم لمولانا تبارك وتعالى, as we said, basically these are example of things that they are necessary and mandatory حكم, rational judgment. However, it takes consideration for you to establish those judgment, like affirming beginningless to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it cannot be imagined in your mind negating it. However, that after bad consideration about what are the consequences of negating it. So if you negated that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beginningless, then a bunch of impossibles comes as a result, which basically means it cannot be the case. Like for example, كالدوري. الدوري, like circular rational. Like if A is dependent on B and B is dependent on A, then neither A or B will occur, right? That's basically circulation, loop, like having loop. And it could be like A, B, or it could be between more than two things, like A is dependable on B, B is dependable in C, and C is dependable on A, and so on. All that is considered circular rationale, which is impossible. والتسلسل, infinite regression back in the past. Again, that's also impossible. Things cannot happen or keep occurring in the past infinitely. And we talked about that in detail in the Kharida. So perhaps you can go and refer to that. But just as a quick example why infinite regression in the past is impossible. You say, for example, if you need a cup of water and you ask somebody to give you like a water to drink. Then you ask that person. That person doesn't have that amount of water. Then he goes away and asks somebody else. And that third person doesn't also have it. And he goes and just basically try to fetch it for you. And he goes and asks somebody else, and so on. If you imagine that situation, that everybody is going infinitely asking for that cup of water, you will never get that water. But if you are holding it in your hand, that means that down that chain of people trying and fetch that for you, at the end, there was an end where someone had that cup of water and he passed it on, and then it passed it on all the way until it reaches you. So the mere fact that you are holding it in your hand means that there is no infinite regression, because there must be an end to that chain. Otherwise, you wouldn't have that. And it's exactly about the universe and the world that we live in. The fact that this world exists and we are living in it means that it had a beginning. Otherwise, it would have never, if it is dependable on something in the past to do it, and basically like a backward kind of chain, a causation chain infinitely, it will never come to existence. So basically, as you consider those concepts and you find that those concepts are impossible, you will have to establish and you have to affirm that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is beginningless, and there is God exists that caused everything to happen and created everything from Adam, from non-existence. Also, ta'addud al-aliha is a concept like multiple gods, concept that is impossible. But again, you don't reach it right away. You reach it through another, through consideration and thinking. Also, تخصيص كل واحد منهم بنوع من الممكنات بلا مخصص. This is also an very important concept, which is anything that exists that has amount, that has volume or amount, or has like carry out certain characteristics in terms of كم, for example, what we call كم or كيف, how and amount, volume. This is a possible amount. So something pre-existed it must have decided or caused that amount precisely to occur. If you think about something that has amount occurring on its own without something defining it, then that's impossible. Okay? What we call a تخصيص بلا مخصص. Specifying something without, or something specified comes to existence without specifier, something that is specified. It can't happen because it is specified. Then, by definition, by nature, something has to have defined it prior to it comes into existence. ونظير هذا في الوجوب النظري كون الواحد ربع عشر الأربعين. Now he is giving you a closer example from the second type, which is al-wujub, but through another. Like when I tell you, for example, 1 is quarter of 10th of 40. Right. It will take you a while, maybe a calculator, to come to that conclusion. And then you say, yeah, it's exactly true. It's much more complicated or not complicated, much more away from your mind to establish right away than, for example, me telling you that 1 is half of 2. 1 is half of 2. It's necessary. It's basically, you reach that without consideration. But 1 is quarter of 10th of 40. You need some time to reach it, and that's why you need consideration. That's basically what he's giving you an example of. Right. Then, وهذا الواجب المعرف هو الواجب الذاتي. What we've been talking about now is the necessary or the mandatory by itself, in itself, by its own standing, by its own merit. There is another type of necessary, which is عرضي, something that happened by accident. And that is basically وهو ما يجب لتعلق إرادة الله تعالى به كتعذيب أبي جهل فإنه بالنظر إلى ذاته جائز يصح في العقل وجوده وعدمه. And so basically this type is something like punishment, and or like Abu Jahl, for example, the kafir Abu Jahl. his punishment in hellfire. In its own, like in its own merit, it is not necessary. Like logically, from a rational and logic point of view, he could suffer in hellfire, or he could have pleasure in paradise, in Jannah. It's basically possible, both sides. However, when you add to that what the Prophet, peace be upon him, said about him, and that he is in hellfire, then him being punished in hellfire becomes a necessary rule of even al-aql, even of rationale. Because what? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, his will cannot be challenged, cannot change. Nobody can challenge Allah's will subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah's will, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed Abu Jahl that he's going to be in hellfire. Once we know that, then this judgment now becomes necessary, but we call it necessary by accident, okay, or aradi, because in its own merit, it's possible. It just became, or lifted to become, or elevated to become necessary because of the fact that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed it. وإنما لم يحتاج إلى تقييد الواجب بالذاتي لأنه عند الإطلاق لا يحمل إلا على الذاتي. So basically he's saying he didn't qualify the word wajib by its own merit. He didn't add it, didn't like call it that name. He just called wajib because when you basically just say it out of any qualification or without any qualification, the meaning becomes the dhati, the type of the dhati. ولا يحمل على العرض إلا بالتقييد. So basically, if I said necessary, then it has to be necessary on its own merit. If I said necessary by accident, then I qualified it. I basically refer to exactly what I mean. So there is no confusion, no ambiguity here. So basically what he's saying is you don't have to say wajib or mandatory or necessary on its own merit and necessary by accident. You can just say necessary, and this will mean the necessary on its own merit right away, or necessary by accident, and then you qualified it. Now you know what you're talking about. All right. Moving on to the impossible. The Sheikh is saying والمستحيل ما لا يتصور في العقل وجوده إما ضرورة كتعري الجرم عن الحركة والسكون معا وإما نظرا كالشريك لمولانا جل وعز. Basically, the impossible is something that in your rationale, in your mind, you cannot imagine its existence. إما ضرورة, again, like what we said in the other, the mandatory or the necessary, there were two types. The necessary, the wajib, but by necessity, or the wajib through consideration. Same way, same thing here. Mustahil, impossible, necessarily, or impossible through consideration. Necessarily, كتعري الجرم عن الحركة والسكون. If there is a particle, body, mass, you cannot imagine it being at rest and moving at the same time. Or basically, you can say it doesn't have movement or rest. It has to have one of those, right? So basically, lifting those two status from the particle is impossible. ضرورة, necessarily. وإما نظرا, like with consideration, كالشريك لمولانا جل وعز. So as if you have like a كشريك, like a partner to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like another God with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is also mustahil, impossible, but it is impossible through consideration. Otherwise, people wouldn't have committed shirk at all, right? So what also he's saying, هذا أيضا هو المستحيل الذاتي, impossible on its own merit. وأما المستحيل لعارض منفصل عنه, again by accident or for other reason, فهو من قبيل الجائز كاستحالة إيمان أبي لهب. Like for example, إيمان أبي لهب. Abi Lahab becoming a believer of the Prophet, peace be upon him. Abi Lahab, we know from the Quran, tabbat yada Abi Lahabin wa tab. So basically, he's been judged by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he is in hellfire, he is a kafir. So him becoming mu'min or becoming believer or becoming Muslim even before he dies is impossible. Impossible by mind, like rational impossible, but not by its own, not under like the first type here, not under its own merit, but through something else, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala willed it and made that decree basically. Right? Because لما عرض له من إرادة الله تعالى لعدمه, because of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decided and decreed that he cannot become a mu'min. Because of that, his iman becomes impossible. Right. ونظير تعري الجرم عن الحركة والسكون أي تجرده عنهما معا في كونه مستحيلا ضرورا أي ابتداء بلا تأمل, as we said before. Another example of so again he's trying to get the concept closer to your mind through things that is much more familiar to everybody. So الجرم عن تعري الجرم عن الحركة والسكون, body that doesn't have or that is not moving and it is not at rest at the same time. This is impossible. Another example from the same category is what? الاثنين, 2, ربع الأربعة. If I say 2 is quarter of 4, it's more impossible. That is wrong, right? 2 is half of 4, not quarter of 4, right? أو نصف 8. All that is impossible. Half of 8. 2 is not half of 8. That's impossible. أو نحو ذلك من المستحيل, or like that from the مستحيل ضرورة necessarily. ونظير الشريك في كونه مستحيلا بالنظر أي بعد التأمل كون الواحد نصف عشر 40. So and again, like another example for the mustahil through consideration, the impossible through consideration, like affirming another God with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which you reach through consideration and thinking process. If you say 1 is half tenth of 40, again that's impossible, okay, because 1 is not half tenth of 40, it's a quarter tenth of 40, right, as we said before. All right, so it takes, you need like to think about it a little bit. You need to get calculator and start making like 40 and divide it by 10 and divide it by 2 and see it is 1 or 2 or whatever, and basically reach the conclusion. So it needs, but that conclusion is either like in that case, that conclusion is impossible. That judgment, you cannot reach that conclusion. It's impossible to reach it, but through consideration. Now he moves on to حد الجائز. What do you think, guys? Do you want to continue or leave it for later? Right. حد الجائز. الجائز, which is possible, ممكن. الجائز or ممكن all means possible, right? والجائز ما يصح في العقل وجوده وعدمه. Something that your mind will accept. It's either existence or non-existence, or affirming or negating. إما ضرورة, again same concept, either necessarily right away, like الحركة لنا, movement for us, for a human being. الحركة, movement. Is it possible or not? Possible. We could decide to move or stop and then move again, whatever. So basically affirming movement to a human being is something that is possible عقلا, from a rational point of view. وإما نظرا, through consideration, كتعذيب المطيع وإثابة العاصي. تعذيب المطيع, somebody who's basically أطاع Allah, has obedience, but he can be subjected to adab, to punishment. And somebody who disobeyed al-asi, subjected to reward and pleasure. This is something which is possible, but it is possible through consideration. You need consideration to reach that conclusion, as we'll see. Right. الجائز لفظ مشترك يطلق ويراد به هذا الذي ذكرنا هنا. It basically has a lot of meaning. The word جائز. لفظ مشترك. مشترك means it has different meanings. Same word. Like for example, in Arabic, some words will have different meaning. Like ayn. Ayn in Arabic means ayn, which is your eyes. It could mean pond of water. It could mean spy, and so other many meanings. So it's just one word, but it has different meanings. Same with al-jaiz. يطلق ويراد به هذا الذي ذكرنا. So basically what he is defining it as we've said earlier. وهو ما لا يترتب على تقدير وجوده ولا على تقدير عدمه محال لذاته. So basically something that if you imagine its existence or non-existence, nothing impossible will be a consequence, like will result on that. Okay, it will not result in something that is impossible. وهذا معنى قولنا يصح في العقل وجوده وعدمه، أي لا يلزم من هذين التقديرين فيه محال لذاته, as we said. ويدخل فيه ثلاثة أقسام. الأول, there are three types in الجائز possible. The first, الجائز المقطوع بوجوده. So it is a something that possible, but its existence is basically affirmed, like fully affirmed. مقطوع يعني it has to happen. كاتصاف الجرم المطلق بخصوص البياض أو خصوص الحركة ونحوهما، وكالبعث والثواب والعقاب ونحو ذلك. So if we say particle or a mass, it will have an attribute. It will have an attribute that it could be white, for example. It could be other color. It will have certain attributes. So those certain attributes are within themselves possible, but something has to be there. Like if I said a body, or if you imagine a body, then right away the certain characteristics will have to be within that body. Okay, like for example, haraka, movement. So it would be it may not be moving, but that movement is right away is necessarily and right away is a characteristic to that body. وكالبعث والثواب والعقاب ونحو ذلك. So basically we البعث, resurrection, reward, punishment, and نحو ذلك, and things like that, we affirm they are happening. They are in themselves, they are جائز, possible, which means they could happen or not, but we affirm, but nevertheless, right, like we affirm they are going to happen, right? الثاني الجائز المقطوع بعدمه. So it's opposite of the first one. Like what? إيمان أبي لهب وأبي جهل ودخول الكافر الجنة ونحو ذلك. So basically Abu Lahab or Abi Jahl becoming mu'min, or their iman, they're becoming mu'mins and believers basically. ودخول الكافر الجنة, a kafir, non-believer, goes to paradise and enters paradise. Again, that's jaiz in itself, but we say no, it is impossible to happen because of something else, because as we talked about before, right? Anyway, الثالث المحتمل للوجود والعدم, something that could happen, could not happen, like absolutely, with an absolute stance. Like what? كقبول الطاعة منا. For example, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala accepts our ta'a, our prayers and our salah and our obedience. He may accept, he may not accept. It's possible. It's basically, we don't know. This could happen, this could happen. We cannot establish or affirm one or the other. وفوزنا بحسن الخاتمة, that we basically reach the ultimate or the best ending of our life. والسلامة من عذاب الآخرة, and that we are not being punished in hellfire or in الآخرة. on the judgment day, and like that. All these are things that we cannot. It's basically possible either way. All right. وإنما زدنا التقييد. So basically, Sheikh, as previously in the necessary or mandatory, the wajib, and in the mustahil, the impossible, there are things that they could be in their own merit. They could happen, but or they could be possible on their own merit, like with like cutting out any relation with anything else. But once you establish the relation of the reality we know, you will have to make other judgment. Like as we said, it is possible, but basically it cannot. It will have to happen, as we said, like al-ba'th wal-thawab, because Quran said that. Then it will have to happen. Although in its own, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala may have not decided to have a resurrection. He decided that there is going to be a resurrection. Allah decided there is going to be a reward and punishment. He could have decided otherwise. Okay? And so on. Right. And basically that's the part we're talking about that. ليدخل فيه القسمان الأولان هو المقطوع بوجوده والمقطوع بعدمه، في كل واحد منهما بالنظر إلى ذاته by in its own merit لا يلزم محال من وجوده ولا عدمه. By in its own merit, if you think about either it's happening or not, it will not result on an impossible situation, right? As we said, ثواب والعقاب, reward and punishment, بالنظر إلى basically exactly what we explained right, just now. مثلا بالنظر إلى حقيقتهما لا يلزم في وجودهما ولا عدمهما محال ولو نظرنا إلى ما تعلق بهما. So basically this is the word. If we thought about or that issue relation or that issue in relation to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us about, then we'll have to affirm their existence. Right. Because if we don't do that, then لترتب حينئذ على عدمهما محال وهو الكذب والخلف في خبر من يستحيل عليه ذلك. So الكذب, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saying a lie is impossible. The prophets, peace be upon them all, lying is impossible. That is just an impossible thing. So if Allah said there is going to be a thawab, reward, and there is punishment. Now, reward and punishment on its own merit, in stand alone, without looking at anything else that they connected to, in their own merit, they are possible. They could happen, they could not happen. But because they connected now, they have a relation with Allah's order, Allah's kalam, and Allah's speech, which cannot be a lie, then they will have to happen. We cannot think they are not going to happen. We cannot establish or we cannot make a judgment that they are possible, because now their non-existence becomes impossible. Okay? وكذا دخول الكافر الجنة. All that basically what we talked about. ويطلق الجائز أيضا ويراد به المحتمل والمشكوك في وجوده وعدمه، فيكون هذا خاصا بالقسم الثالث. So الجائز also, the word جائز, may be used to refer to something that is possible, and or that basically you are not sure about whether you are not sure about its existence or non-existence. فيكون هذا خاصا بالقسم الثالث. So basically that's basically only like that third part here. Okay? Which is mostly what we mean by al-jaiz. So it could either refer to these two things here. So they are jaiz, as we said, but you have to, because of something else, you have to affirm whether they exist or non-existence. The third is basically you are unsure, cannot decide on that or this or that. It could be either sides. Okay, that's basically what to say. Right. ويطلق الجائز أيضا ويراد به ما أذن الشرع في فعله وتركه. That's basically the fiqh. The fiqh meaning of the word جائز, allowable, permissible basically here. ما أذن الشرع, الشريعة, permitted, whether you can do it or not do it. Okay. can be you can do something or cannot do something. It's also called jaiz, which is basically in that case it's meaning the same word as mubah, which is permissible. كالبيع والنكاح ونحوهما, trading and selling and buying and getting married and all that kind of stuff. أو ما أذن الشرع في فعله وإن لم يأذن في تركه فيكون على هذا أعم من المباح. So it could be something that the Sharia permitted its action or you doing it, or somebody like the Muslims doing it, but it didn't allow not doing it. In that case, it's also wajib wal mandub, not just mubah. It will be mubah and also wajib wa mandub. So basically, al-jaiz, as you see here, has a lot of meaning from a aql and rational judgment point of view. We talked about it, but also from a fiqh point of view, Sharia allowed or permitted something to happen or not happen, or something action that you can do or not do, then it's mubah, permissible. But it could also be something that the Sharia permitted its action and did not permit that you leave it, and that is basically al-wajib, prayer. So it is it jaiz or not to pray al-dhuhr, for example? Yeah, it is jaiz, you can do that, but you cannot leave it, you have to do it, then it becomes wajib, and so on. It's just different definition of the or usage of the word depending on the context. وبالجملة, in general, فالجائز الذي هو أحد أقسام الحكم العقلي إنما يريدون به المعنى الأول. Right? وهو ما لا يترتب على تقدير وجوده ولا على تقدير عدمه بالنظر إلى ذاته محال، وليس بمعنى المحتمل المشكوك فيه ولا بمعنى المأذون فيه شرعا ولا بمعنى المباح. So basically, in general, when you say جائز, you refer to the جائز عقلا. We're talking about جائز عقلا from a rational point of view, the general جائز, which could be like جائز in its own merit. That's basically what we mean, which will include the three categories or three types we talked about earlier here. 1, 2, 3. All of those are jaiz on its own merit. Okay? Even the one that we, after another layer of consideration, we say no, it cannot happen or can happen in its own merit or in their own merit, they are still jaiz. And when we say jaiz or mumkin from an absolute point of view or general point of view, we mean all those. Okay? ويطلق أيضا على الجائز الذي هو أحد أقسام الحكم العقلي الممكن. So basically you can call it جائز or you can call it ممكن. فالممكن والجائز العقلي في اصطلاح المتكلمين مترادفان, same meaning, synonymous. So you can say ممكن or جائز عقلي. Both of these two terms are exactly the same from the point of متكلمين. والممكن الخاص, this is important point here, والممكن الخاص عند أهل المنطق هو المرادف للجائز العقلي. Now we have ممكن like special ممكن or general ممكن, خاص وعام. الممكن الخاص عند أهل المنطق, not just the متكلمين but also the traditional logic scholars, مرادف meaning what? Meaning الجائز العقلي. الجائز العقلي. So if I say ممكن خاص, and I'm talking from the point of view of the mantiq people or mantiq scholars, then I'm referring to جائز العقلي. وأما الممكن العام عندهم فهو ما لا يمتنع وقوعه فيدخل في. So that's the special ممكن. The ممكن العام, the general ممكن for those scholars, فهو ما لا يمتنع وقوعه, something that its occurrence is not negated or not impossible. It's possible basically to happen. فيدخل فيه الواجب والجائز العقليان. So basically if you say if you're reading in a traditional logic book or other books basically, and you see somebody talking about ممكن العام, the general ممكن, then this is not just the jaiz or the possible ممكن that we're talking about here, it also include the necessary, right? So we have three things, as you said, أحكام العقل. What are the أحكام العقل? We have necessary or mandatory, the واجب, the مستحيل, impossible, and جائز. Okay? When I say جائز or ممكن, just like that, from a متكلمين point of view, these are the three categories. Okay? Now, in some books, or in some scholars' language and terminology, especially for like logic, traditional logic, and even philosophers, they may refer to something called ممكن خاص, special ممكن, special possible, or ممكن عام, general ممكن. If they refer to ممكن خاص, the possible, the special possible with speciality or specific or something like that. So basically, this is exactly as a possible in أحكام العقل. If they say ممكن عام, general possible, then this includes, that terminology now includes the necessary, the rational necessary, and the rational possible. It does not, it excludes only the impossible, because the impossible cannot happen, right? So the ممكن العام in this definition is something that can happen, and something can happen or happens. What is that? What can happen? The necessary, it happens, so it have to happen. So it's basically ممكن from that point of view. Or الجائز also, العقلي, also that will happen. Okay? So again, it's just terminology, and if you don't know this terminology and you're reading other books, you could get very, very confused. So الممكن الخاص is the possible that we're talking about. ممكن العام will include the possible and will include the necessary. Only excludes المستحيل, impossible. I hope this is clear. Alright. وقولنا في مثل الجائز الضروري كالحركة لنا معناه أن الجائز أيضا على قسمين, same concept. الجائز, the possible, العقلي, from rational point of view, are two types or two categories. Either ضروري, necessarily you reach that conclusion, or something that you don't reach it, or you only reach it through consideration and contemplating and thinking and so on. So basically that's the part here. وجائز لا يدرك إلا بالتأمل. So this part here is جائز تدرك صحة وجوده وعدمه ضرورة, necessarily right away without consideration. As basically, as we said, like for example, we are characterized, have characteristics or attributes of movement or being at rest and so on. And the possible that you can only reach through consideration and thinking and contemplating process, like for example كتعذيب من أطاع الله تعالى ولم يعصيه قط. So somebody never disobeyed Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and what about him being punished? Is that possible or not? Right? So فإن هدف الابتداء قد ينكر العقل جوازه. Like at the beginning, your mind may deny its possibility. You say no, it can't. How can he? بل يتوهمه مستحيلا كما توهمته المعتزلة. المعتزلة said this is impossible, and that basically is a وهم, is imagining, but or delusion, is not reality. وأما بعد النظر في وحدانية الله تعالى, but when you think about الوحدانية of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the oneness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, وانفراده بخلق جميع الممكنات وإرادتها بلا واسطة, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will is without intermediate, his will happens with no intermediate, or is not dependable on somebody else to allow it or anything like that. خيرا كانت أو شرا, وأن الأفعال كلها بالنسبة إليه تعالى سواء, all actions from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, like all actions to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the same. لا نفع له تبارك وتعالى في طاعة. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not benefit from obedience, and non-obedience does not cause harm to him subhanahu wa ta'ala, حاشا لله, and does not reduce him his like he's killing them or anything like that. Kafir, kufr al-kafir, and ma'asiyat, the disobedience of a kafir or non-believer, or the obedience of a believer does not add or harm to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala anything, or doesn't cause Allah anything. Then, at that point, when you consider that, you reach to conclusion that أن ما رتبه سبحانه وتعالى على الكفر من العذاب الأليم وعلى الطاعة من النعيم المقيم، لو عكس تعالى في ذلك أو لم يرتب جل وعلا عليهما شيئا أصلا، لم يلزم عن ذلك بالنظر إلى حقيقة الطاعة والكفر والمعصية نقص ولا محال أصلا. So because of that, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the obedience or the obedience doesn't harm him or doesn't benefit him, as we said, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decided or decreed there are consequences to obedience and non-obedience. But if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decided not to make that decree, or even if reversed it, nothing impossible would have resulted from that. And because of that, it becomes possible. So it just requires a little bit of thinking and realization that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, everything to him is the same. And therefore, that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward to believer is fadl, is basically just favor of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He doesn't have to do that. And also punishment of the kafir is being just, and nothing result from that to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in terms of being of harm or benefit. وبالله التوفيق. So basically now we finished this part. Next time inshallah we'll talk about the madhab of scholars, or basically the general even madhabs in terms of free will. But before we finish, like one last note that I noticed many people get confused about is who created Ahkam al-Aql. We talked about Ahkam al-Aql, right? Necessary, impossible, and mandatory, and so on. Who created them? Now, these Ahkam, these rational judgment are not created. They are relations. They are established as a matter of fact because of the reality we live in. So they are abstract concepts. They are non. There is nothing called Hukm Aqli moving around, right? So it's basically nothing created. It is a result or it's relations that your mind will have to establish because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a necessary being and because we are possible beings. Like, for example, if I say the concept of 1 and 2, the concept of numbers, that concept of numbers only, like we rationalize it and understand it, and we make judgment based on that numbers because of the way the creation is, because there is creation of 1, 2, 3 and multiple people around and so on. So just because of that, then the concept and abstract of concept of numbers exist and so on. Exactly the same with the Ahkam al-Aql. They are not something that's been created or made. Otherwise, that basically will result on non-existence of God. Because if they are created, then that means the necessary is something that's been created. That means the necessity of existence of God is basically not necessary, right? And why there is a God then? There is nothing necessarily proves the existence of God. It is because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists necessarily, then that means that there is a necessary judgment, there is a possible judgment, there is an impossible judgment, rationally. Okay? I hope this is clear. Inshallah, we'll continue next time. Are there any questions? All right, no questions. So see you next time, inshallah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك استغفرك اللهم من كل ذنب واتوب اليك وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى اله وسلم تسليما كثيرا.